For years, she moved through royal circles with a confidence few dared question. Invitations arrived without request, doors opened without hesitation. Palace staff treated her presence as routine. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. A decision reportedly signed under King Charles's authority stripped Camilla's sister of privileges she had quietly enjoyed for years. What seemed like an administrative adjustment quickly exploded into one of the most whispered-about royal controversies of the year. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For a long time, few people paid attention to the quiet privileges that existed around the edges of royal life. The public focused on the senior members of the monarchy, the official engagements, the state occasions, and the carefully managed appearances that defined the institution. Yet behind that public image existed a network of relationships, understandings, and traditions that often operated far from public scrutiny. According to growing reports circulating among royal observers, Camilla's sister had become a familiar presence within certain royal circles, enjoying access and accommodations that many simply assumed would continue indefinitely. There were no public announcements, no dramatic warnings, no indication that anything was about to change. Then, the rumors began. At first, they appeared as scattered whispers moving through palace corridors and media circles. A canceled arrangement here, a denied request there. Small details that meant little on their own, but together suggested something unusual was unfolding. What made the situation even more intriguing was the speed with which the alleged changes were implemented. Palace insiders reportedly described an atmosphere of unusual urgency, with decisions being carried out faster than many expected. That alone was enough to spark questions. Why now? Why so suddenly? And perhaps most importantly, who had convinced the king that action was necessary? Those questions quickly spread beyond palace walls. Royal commentators began discussing whether long-standing assumptions about informal family access were finally being challenged. For years, many believed that certain privileges existed simply because of proximity to the throne. It was an arrangement rarely discussed publicly but widely understood within royal circles. Suddenly, that understanding appeared far less secure. If someone connected so closely to the queen consort could lose access, what did that say about the direction the monarchy was taking behind closed doors? The silence from senior aides only intensified the mystery. Requests for clarification reportedly received little response. Officials refused to elaborate. Palace representatives remained carefully guarded. The absence of answers created a vacuum that speculation rushed to fill. Every refusal to comment generated another theory. Every unanswered question encouraged another round of whispers. Instead of calming the controversy, the silence seemed to feed it. Perhaps the most surprising element of all was the belief that Camilla herself had not anticipated the move. Reports suggested that the decision caught many observers off guard, including those closest to the situation. If true, that revelation transformed what looked like a routine administrative adjustment into something far more significant. Suddenly, this was no longer just about access or privileges. It became a story about influence, authority, and shifting power inside one of the world's most scrutinized institutions. As speculation intensified, many began to wonder whether the decision reflected a broader effort to redefine boundaries within the royal household. Others believed deeper tensions had been brewing for far longer than anyone realized. Whatever the truth may be, one thing became increasingly clear. This controversy was not created overnight. The signs, according to those watching closely, had been accumulating for some time. But the real shock was not the privileges themselves, it was the growing belief that this decision had been building behind palace walls for months. At first, the concerns appeared minor. Small complaints, quiet objections. Administrative notes buried beneath larger royal matters. Yet as those concerns accumulated, senior officials allegedly began asking difficult questions about boundaries, access, and influence. What began as routine reviews soon transformed into something much larger, drawing attention from some of the monarchy's most trusted advisors and forcing uncomfortable conversations about where loyalty should truly lie. In the aftermath of the decision that reportedly stripped Camilla's sister of several long-enjoyed privileges, the atmosphere surrounding the royal household began to change in ways few people anticipated. What had initially been dismissed as palace gossip slowly evolved into a matter of serious discussion among those responsible for protecting the institution itself. According to royal insiders, questions that once lingered quietly in the background were suddenly being brought into formal conversations. The issue was no longer centered on a single individual. Instead, attention turned toward a broader concern: how close was too close when it came to family connections and royal influence. Reports suggested that internal reviews were quietly launched to examine existing household arrangements. On the surface, these reviews appeared routine. The monarchy regularly evaluates procedures, access rights, and operational structures. Yet those familiar with the process allegedly noticed something different this time. The questions being asked were more specific. The scrutiny was more intense. Officials were no longer looking only at official roles. They were examining the informal relationships that had developed over years, perhaps even decades, beneath the public gaze. As investigators reportedly dug deeper, concerns emerged about the increasingly blurred line between royal duty and personal family connections. The monarchy had always relied on trust. It was an institution built upon tradition, discipline, and clearly understood boundaries. But critics within palace circles allegedly worried that some of those boundaries had become difficult to define. Certain accommodations that once seemed harmless were now being viewed through an entirely different lens. What had once been considered courtesy was suddenly being questioned as privilege. What had once been viewed as routine access was now becoming the subject of uncomfortable scrutiny. Senior staff reportedly began documenting access arrangements with unusual detail. Meetings were held, records were reviewed, questions multiplied. Who authorized particular privileges? How long had certain arrangements existed? Were all members of the extended royal circle being treated equally? The deeper officials looked, the more complicated the situation appeared. And with each new layer uncovered, divisions reportedly began forming among long-serving courtiers. Some believed the reviews were necessary and overdue. They argued that the monarchy could not afford even the appearance of favoritism, particularly during a period of growing public scrutiny. Others felt the process was becoming unnecessarily aggressive, targeting individuals who had operated within accepted norms for years. The disagreement created tension behind closed doors. Loyal friendships were tested. Long-standing alliances became strained. Suddenly, a matter that appeared administrative on paper was evolving into a debate about the future identity of the royal institution itself. At the center of it all stood King Charles. According to reports, detailed briefings eventually reached his desk outlining concerns, recommendations, and potential consequences. Each document reportedly painted a slightly different picture. Some emphasized accountability, others warned about family fallout. The king found himself facing an increasingly delicate situation, one where every decision carried political and personal risks. And as those reports accumulated, many began to suspect that the issue extended far beyond a single review of privileges. As the investigation widened, attention shifted from palace procedures to the individuals who benefited from them. The controversy soon expanded beyond a single privilege. Observers began scrutinizing the wider network surrounding Queen Camilla and the role her relatives played within royal life. While no official wrongdoing was suggested, the perception of influence became impossible to ignore. Suddenly, every invitation, appearance, and connection was being examined under a microscope, creating pressure unlike anything the Queen Consort's family had faced before. What had started as a discussion about revoked privileges was no longer confined to one individual. The story had grown larger, more complicated, and far more uncomfortable for everyone involved. As reports continued to circulate regarding the king's decision, attention naturally drifted toward the broader circle surrounding Queen Camilla. People who had rarely attracted public scrutiny suddenly found themselves becoming subjects of intense discussion. Royal commentators, newspaper columnists, and palace observers all seemed to be asking variations of the same question. How much influence should extended family members have within the orbit of the monarchy? The question itself was powerful because it touched upon something deeper than any single controversy. The monarchy has always balanced two competing realities. On one hand, it is a family. On the other, it is an institution that survives through public trust. When those two realities exist in harmony, few people pay attention. But when they appear to collide, even slightly, the resulting tension can become impossible to ignore. As public interest intensified, greater scrutiny reportedly fell upon Camilla's extended family. Past appearances, private invitations, and long-standing relationships were suddenly revisited through an entirely different lens. Actions that once attracted little attention were now being interpreted as evidence of broader patterns. Whether those interpretations were fair or not became a matter of fierce debate. What mattered was that the discussion had taken on a life of its own. The issue of fairness soon emerged as the dominant theme. Critics questioned whether all royal relatives received equal treatment. Supporters argued that personal relationships naturally create opportunities and trust. Comparisons began appearing across royal circles. Some observers pointed to other members of the wider royal family who had faced strict limitations despite their blood ties. Others argued that every situation carried unique circumstances and should not be judged through a single standard. The divide only deepened as more voices entered the conversation. Media outlets seized upon the uncertainty. Speculation regarding influence within palace circles became a constant topic of discussion. Every report seemed to generate 3 more theories. Every explanation created new questions. The lack of definitive answers allowed narratives to flourish, and soon the story was no longer being driven by facts alone, but by perception. That perception became a challenge the palace could not easily control. Meanwhile, reports suggested that Queen Camilla found herself privately defending members of her family. For years, they had existed largely outside the center of royal controversy. Now they were being discussed as symbols of a larger debate about access, privilege, and influence. Those close to the situation allegedly believed Camilla viewed much of the criticism as unfair. Yet the growing pressure made it increasingly difficult to separate personal feelings from institutional concerns. Throughout the controversy, palace officials reportedly remained committed to emphasizing neutrality. The monarchy, they insisted, must operate according to established principles rather than personal connections. It was a message designed to reassure the public, but it also carried an unmistakable implication. If neutrality truly guided decisions, then no relationship, regardless of proximity to the throne, could remain beyond review. As public arguments intensified and speculation dominated headlines, a deeper struggle was beginning to emerge beneath the surface. The debate was no longer simply about perception. It was becoming a question of authority, responsibility, and the future direction of the royal household itself. Yet while public attention focused on perception, a far more decisive conversation was unfolding behind closed doors. Few positions are more difficult than that of a king forced to choose between personal loyalty and institutional responsibility. According to palace whispers, Charles found himself standing at precisely that crossroads. Every option carried consequences. Protecting family risked criticism. Enforcing protocol risked conflict. The deeper advisors examined the matter, the clearer it became that a decision would eventually have to be made, and that someone would leave disappointed. By this stage, the controversy had evolved far beyond questions of public perception. The discussion was no longer focused solely on who had access to certain privileges or why those arrangements existed. Instead, it had become a test of leadership at the highest level of the monarchy. At the center of that test stood King Charles, a monarch already carrying the immense burden of preserving stability during a period of uncertainty. What made the situation particularly delicate was that there appeared to be no easy path forward. Every recommendation seemed to solve one problem while creating another. According to reports circulating among royal observers, Charles began receiving increasingly detailed advice from multiple directions. Some advisors reportedly argued that the monarchy's long-term credibility depended upon maintaining clear boundaries. They believed the institution could not afford even the appearance of inconsistency when it came to access, privilege, and accountability. To them, the issue was larger than any individual. It was about preserving public trust and ensuring that royal standards remained protected regardless of personal relationships. Yet not everyone shared that view. Other voices allegedly urged caution. They warned that rigid enforcement could create unnecessary divisions at a time when unity was desperately needed. They argued that loyalty should not be measured solely through rules and procedures. Relationships mattered. Personal history mattered. Compassion mattered. The debate became increasingly emotional because both sides believed they were protecting something important. One side sought to defend the institution. The other sought to preserve harmony within the family itself. As these competing arguments reached the king's inner circle, concerns reportedly emerged about the precedents any decision might establish. Senior officials allegedly raised difficult questions. If exceptions were permitted in one case, could they be denied in another? If boundaries remained unclear today, what challenges might future generations inherit? These were not temporary concerns. They touched upon the very framework through which the monarchy would operate for years to come. The implications extended well beyond the immediate controversy. The strain began spreading throughout royal circles. Courtiers reportedly found themselves navigating increasingly sensitive discussions. Long-standing relationships were tested. Conversations became more guarded. Every new development seemed to deepen the uncertainty surrounding the final outcome. Those closest to the palace allegedly sensed that something significant was approaching, even if no one could yet predict exactly what form it would take. Amid the growing tension, reports suggested that Queen Camilla advocated for a more flexible approach. According to palace whispers, she believed understanding and perspective were essential in assessing the situation. From her viewpoint, family relationships could not simply be reduced to administrative decisions. The human element mattered. The personal cost mattered. Yet even as those arguments were reportedly presented, the pressure surrounding the issue continued to grow. Eventually, after weeks of discussion, review, and internal debate, final recommendations were assembled and prepared for the king. What had begun as scattered concerns had now been transformed into a formal decision-making process. The weight of that moment was impossible to ignore. Every report, every opinion, and every warning had led to this point. The future direction of the controversy now rested in Charles's hands alone. When the recommendation finally reached Charles's desk, events began moving much faster than anyone expected. The moment arrived with remarkable speed. What had been discussed for months was suddenly transformed into action. Notices were reportedly issued, access arrangements reviewed, privileges reevaluated. By the time word began circulating among palace staff, the decision was already taking effect. Those closest to the situation described an atmosphere of disbelief as years of assumed access appeared to vanish with a single administrative order. For weeks, the controversy had existed in the realm of speculation, private discussions, and carefully worded briefings. Then, almost without warning, it became reality. Reports suggested that royal household privileges connected to Camilla's sister were formally revoked, with staff instructed to implement the changes immediately. The speed of the process caught many by surprise. What some believed would result in months of debate instead appeared to conclude with a swift and decisive order. Within palace circles, confusion reportedly spread as officials rushed to understand what the changes meant and how they would affect long-standing arrangements. The reaction was immediate. Supporters of the move praised it as a necessary affirmation of protocol, arguing that the monarchy could only maintain public trust by applying standards consistently. Critics, however, questioned both the timing and severity of the decision. To them, the action felt abrupt and unnecessarily disruptive. As details began leaking beyond palace walls, public interest intensified. Commentators, royal watchers, and media outlets quickly transformed the story into a broader debate about privilege, accountability, and influence within the modern monarchy. Inside royal circles, opinions were sharply divided. Some courtiers reportedly viewed the king's decision as an example of institutional responsibility, taking precedence over personal relationships. Others believed it reflected a troubling rigidity at a moment when unity was needed most. The disagreement exposed tensions that had existed quietly beneath the surface for years. What appeared on paper to be a simple administrative matter had become a symbolic struggle over what the monarchy should represent in a changing era. Reports also suggested that Camilla was deeply frustrated by the outcome. While she reportedly understood the pressures surrounding the institution, those close to the situation believed she viewed the decision as unnecessarily harsh. Yet by this point, the controversy had grown beyond the concerns of any single family member. The focus was no longer simply on revoked privileges. It had shifted toward a much larger question about the future direction of the crown itself. As debates intensified across media platforms and within royal circles, attention increasingly turned toward Prince William and the next generation of leadership. Observers began wondering whether this decision reflected a broader transformation already taking shape behind palace walls. Was this an isolated case, or the beginning of a stricter approach to royal accountability? The answer remained uncertain, but the implications were impossible to ignore. And as the arguments continued, many began asking whether this controversy was really about one individual or about the monarchy itself. The deeper observers looked, the more they believed the controversy carried a message larger than any single privilege. To many royal watchers, the move signaled a renewed emphasis on accountability and institutional discipline. Whether intentional or not, the decision appeared to communicate that proximity to the throne would no longer guarantee special treatment. And that interpretation quickly became the story dominating royal discussion. As the debate continued, analysts increasingly viewed the king's decision as more than a response to a specific situation. They saw it as a symbolic statement about the future direction of the monarchy itself. For years, questions about access, influence, and informal privilege had quietly existed beneath the surface of royal life. Now, those questions were impossible to avoid. The controversy forced people to examine not only what had happened, but what it represented. To many observers, the message seemed clear. The institution was placing greater emphasis on transparency, accountability, and consistency than ever before. Comparisons were quickly drawn to previous periods of royal reform, when difficult decisions were made in the name of protecting the crown's long-term credibility. Some commentators praised Charles for demonstrating a willingness to prioritize institutional standards over personal relationships. Others questioned whether the move went too far. Yet regardless of opinion, few could deny that the decision had altered the conversation. Expectations began rising, that additional reviews and policy changes could follow. If one long-standing arrangement could be reconsidered, what other traditions might soon face scrutiny? At the same time, Charles's leadership style came under renewed examination. Supporters described the decision as evidence of quiet determination. Critics saw it as a sign of growing pressure within the palace. Either way, the king found himself at the center of a discussion that extended far beyond the original controversy. Every action was being interpreted as a signal of what kind of monarchy he intended to leave behind. By the end of the storm, one reality had become impossible to ignore. The royal household was entering a new phase, one in which tradition, access, and privilege would face greater scrutiny than ever before. The decision involving Camilla's sister may have begun as a private administrative matter, but it evolved into a defining moment that reshaped perceptions of power inside the monarchy and left lasting questions about who truly belongs within the royal inner circle. The long-term impact was felt not only within palace operations but also in public expectations. Camilla's family now faced a different relationship with the institution, while discussions about accountability continued to gain momentum. Future access arrangements would likely be examined more closely, and the standards applied to royal connections would remain under intense scrutiny. Most importantly, the controversy left behind an unresolved legacy. It answered some questions, but it created many more. Perhaps that is why the story endured long after the decision itself. It was never solely about one privilege, one individual, or one administrative order. It became a reflection of a monarchy attempting to balance tradition with modern expectations, personal loyalty with institutional responsibility, and family ties with public trust. The final chapter may not have been written yet, but the consequences were already becoming part of the royal household's evolving story. Because in the House of Windsor, privileges can disappear with a signature, but the consequences of that signature can echo for generations. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.